In exactly 2 weeks, tens of millions of voters will shuffle into voting booths across the country to make their voices heard. Besides the obvious race for president, voters in 32 states will decide on 120 statewide ballot measures, from taxes to marijuana to campaign finance reform. But what we'll be talking about today is a single measure on California's ballot, the repeal of Proposition 209, that seeks to bring back affirmative action into the college admission process after a 24-year absence. If you love watching our videos and learning new things, be sure to check out our Discord, link in the description below. And let's jump in. To better understand Prop 209, we need to take a step back in time. The controversy surrounding affirmative action in California can be traced back to the historic 1978 Supreme Court case, Regents of the University of California v. Bake. The court said that while UC Davis's use of affirmative action in specific was unlawful, they found that ensuring diversity in the classroom was a prime interest of the state, and thus affirmative action in general was allowed under the Constitution. The initiative to put Prop 209, or the California Civil Rights Initiative, on the ballot was led by advocates that felt that existing affirmative action programs led employers and universities to reject applicants solely based on their race. In the 1996 election, Prop 209 passed with 55% of the votes. In essence, Prop 209 prohibited public institutions from considering race, sex, or ethnicity, specifically in terms of employment, contracting, and education. Today, the biggest impact we see from this is the banning of affirmative action in the admissions of the 250,000 students applying to California public schools every year. But now, Proposition 16 on the ballot this November seeks to overturn Prop 209 and bring affirmative action back to California. Most of the debate around Prop 209 stems around moral or anecdotal experiences. While this channel has no intention to weigh in on these arguments, we do want to look at the facts behind Prop 209. And honestly, from a scientific standpoint, Prop 209 could be considered a near-perfect experiment. Not only can we see how Prop 209 affected admission statistics immediately before and after its implementation, we can compare this data to controls from other states as well as private institutions in California. So, in California, was affirmative action good for the students of color it was meant to help? First, let's look at how affirmative action affects admission statistics in the rest of the country. More than 2/3 of colleges report that the race or ethnicity of applicants has no influence on admissions decisions. Now, even if we could assume that colleges were telling the truth, this doesn't really matter. Because the truth is, the vast majority of colleges are not competitive in admissions and admit a majority of those who apply. During the last admission season, colleges and universities accepted 66% of its applicants, and that doesn't even count community colleges, who admit nearly 80% of applicants. So to really see the impact of affirmative action, we have to look at competitive schools that reject the vast majority of applicants. At Harvard, the average Asian American student had an average sectional SAT score of 770 out of 800. Meanwhile, the average white student had a score of 744, Hispanics 720, and the average African American around 710. And according to the New York Times, even with affirmative action, African American and Hispanic students are more underrepresented today at the nation's top colleges than they were 35 years ago. Affirmative action is meant to establish fair access to higher educational institutions, but across the nation, we can see that underrepresented minorities are only becoming more underrepresented over time. But perhaps it just means that affirmative action hasn't gone far enough. So now let's look at California specifically. The California system is unique because there really isn't any other example to look at where one day affirmative action was legal and the next it wasn't. This allows us to see direct impacts from the repeal of affirmative action. But what we actually see from Prop 209 is that affirmative action actually hurt minorities. First off, the obvious question. If affirmative action is meant to make it easier for minorities to get into secondary education, how could it possibly hurt them? Well, this boils down to a concept known as college matching, or the concept that students should be matched to schools that best match them and their abilities. Let's say we have 3 students. Based on their educational background, one should go to a Tier 1 school, one to a Tier 2 school, and one to a Tier 3 school. With affirmative action, what we saw was that the student who should have gone to a Tier 1 school still goes to a Tier 1 school. But now, the student who should go to a Tier 2 school also goes to a Tier 1 school, and the student who should go to a Tier 3 school goes to a Tier 2 school. Now at first, this seems like a good thing for minorities. After all, they end up attending better schools. But the data tells us this isn't the case, and the students who went to schools better than they should have were less likely to succeed, and that if they went to their appropriate school, they could have done better and been better off in the long run. This is the basic theory, and the evidence does support it. After Prop 209, 4-year graduation rates for underrepresented minorities rose 55%, and 6-year graduation rates rose 75%. This is because of better matching without affirmative action. This is also ignoring the fact that without affirmative action, today the UC system now has the most diverse student body in its entire history. So when affirmative action was removed, not only did more minority students graduate at all UC schools, they graduated faster, meaning they had to pay for less college. And better matching extends beyond graduation rates too. At UC San Diego, the year before Prop 209 was introduced, of the 3,000 students admitted, 20% of whites had a first-year GPA of 3.5 or better. Meanwhile, only one African American student did. No, not 1%, literally one student. But 1 year later, 20% of black students had a 3.5 GPA or better after their first year, comparable with whites. In just 1 year, the number of honor roll students at UC San Diego had gone up nearly 100-fold. And it affected the bottom of the class too. Immediately prior to Prop 209, 15% of black students and 17% of Native Americans had a GPA of less than 2.0 and were in danger of being expelled, compared to only 4% of white students. Immediately after Prop 209, these racial differences were all but eliminated, with black and Native American rates falling to 6% in 1998. And you may think that removing affirmative action kept many minorities out of higher education, but UCSD had only 12 fewer black freshmen in 1998, but it also had 7 fewer with a failing GPA after the first year, meaning those 12 students likely had a chance to attend a school where their chances of success were far greater. While it may seem that more people getting into top-tier schools is for the best, according to the nation's top economist, minority students in the lowest quartile of high schools pursuing STEM programs were twice as likely to graduate from a less competitive UC campus like Santa Cruz or Riverside than they were from the top UC campuses like Berkeley and UCLA, in that order. This is really important because minority students graduating with degrees instead of accruing debt and dropping out with no degree is what would allow them to move up the socioeconomic ladder, which is the goal behind affirmative action in the first place. This all isn't to say that minorities aren't capable or deserving of getting into the state's top schools, but that race-based affirmative action is simply a poorly made band-aid for the much deeper wound that is socioeconomic inequality. An important issue that many California lawmakers refuse to discuss is the deficient performance of California K-12 education. California ranks 40th for educational quality among US states. The reason for this is because, like most of the country, a significant percent of school funding comes from local property taxes. In California, on average, local property taxes make up 60% of school funding, so wealthier areas have more money flowing into educational programs. Ultimately, the wealthiest school districts in California end up spending nearly 10 times more per student than those in impoverished areas. What this means is that students from low-income families typically attend the worst-performing public schools, and only about 5% of African American students are attending high-performing schools, while whites and those of Asian descent are much more likely to attend a high-performing school. Year after year, California's school performance remains far below acceptable, despite substantial budget increases. The bulk of peer-reviewed research shows that this deficiency is significantly related to California's public policy. Research shows that implementing reforms to the rules governing tenure and promotion, to pay criteria, and to the high cost of firing poorly performing teachers would substantially raise student performance. These reforms have become so obviously needed that they're constantly advocated for by policy experts, but they're ultimately suppressed by teacher unions, which in turn have a very close political relationship with many California lawmakers. Overall, the end of affirmative action and race-based admissions vastly improved minority graduation rates, academic performance, and STEM degree attainment through more efficient matching of undergrad applicants with colleges. Addressing representation issues in California requires a fundamental overhaul in how they fund public schools, and not through affirmative action. Just a final note before you click off, in-depth videos like these, especially ones that require a lot of statistics, sourcing, and research, take a lot more time to make than some of my other videos, and they often perform worse. So if you like these in-depth looks at more political and intensive topics like affirmative action, gun control, or climate change, be sure to drop a like and a comment down below. I say this every video, but it's honestly one of the best ways to help small channels like this grow and keep producing the content you like. As always, have a great day, and remember, there's always more to learn.